Hi, my name is Andrew Unger. Thanks for inviting me. I'd like to thank the folks at Punocracy, Kunle, and God's Will for inviting me to be part of World Satire Day. This is my first trip to Nigeria, although here I am at home in Canada. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit about satire and satirical literacy. I think I was asked the question whether satire is something that is just within people or it's something that can be taught. I think the answer to that question is to some degree both. I think there are definitely people who just have more of that sarcastic, facetious, satirical sense of humor, and other people less so. But I do think it is something that can be taught and learned and developed. A lot of times people ask me about my background with satire and where that came from. A professor at the University of Winnipeg asked me. He said, "I knew both of your grandfathers." He actually did. He knew my grandfathers. He said, "I knew your grandfathers, and where did you get your sense of humor?" And I took him to say that my grandfathers didn't really have a sense of humor. So where did I get my sense of humor from? And I don't know if I have an answer other than it probably was a lot of television shows and movies I was watching and books I was reading that kind of just developed that sense of humor. But when I was a little kid, when I was 12 years old, I wrote. This is not normal 12-year-old behavior, I'm sure. But I filled notebooks with political cartoons satirizing the Canadian Prime Minister at the time. And I filled, I think, 4 or 5 notebooks. I still have them in the closet here. And then, my satirical leanings kind of went away for a while, and they kind of came back more recently. Of course, I've been doing writing for quite a long time, but and I'm also a teacher, as you may know. I've taught satire at the high school level, the secondary level for about 15 years. And in 2016, I started a satire website about my own cultural and religious background called the Mennonites. That's my background. I'm not going to tell you all about what Mennonites are or whatever. You can look it up on Wikipedia. The Wikipedia article about it is pretty good, pretty reliable. One of the things though about my own background that you may find interesting, and the Mennonites in particular, at least in Canada, I don't want to generalize about Mennonites around the world, but at least in Canada, if you go back a few generations, the Mennonites were very traditional and strict, and they almost thought that laughing and telling jokes was wrong, that you shouldn't do it. You should be serious all the time. Life was serious, and you shouldn't laugh. In fact, I read a quote in a book that my great uncle wrote about my family, my own family, and this is all, of course, before I was born. He said, "Humor and boisterous laughter was frowned upon by our conservative Mennonite ancestors. Too much fun was considered frivolous, if not downright sinful. So children were discouraged from showing lightheartedness and frivolity." And he talks about how his sister, my great aunt, told of the times she observed Dad, that's my great grandfather, in the company of his brothers, having an enjoyable time, laughing heartily. And she felt confused because she thought it was wrong to have so much fun. That's the sort of background that I come from, if you go back 2 generations, not only was satire totally unknown, but even laughing and comedy was definitely, like, there were very few circumstances where that would have been allowed. Now, that's talking about 80 years ago, right? We're talking about quite a long time. So a lot has changed since then. I read another article that described how as recently as about 40 years ago, so in the early 1980s, some Mennonite periodicals, some Mennonite magazines tried to run satire articles, columns, and satirical columns in them. And it got such a negative reaction that that they had to stop doing it. And this was in the early 80s. I'm telling you this because I want to encourage you that things change. If you're writing satire and you think, well, people aren't reacting, people aren't getting it, etc. Those things change over time. It may take a while, but somebody has to be kind of the pioneers to do it, to put it out there, and maybe it'll take a while before it's accepted in society or whatever, as it did with my background. Um, but now, as I said, in 2016, I started the Daily Bonnet, which is a Canadian satire website, but a lot of the jokes, or most of the jokes, are about my own cultural background of Mennonites, and now it's quite popular. And I don't take credit for this. I think there were writers that came before me that kind of broke that ground in the 1980s and 1990s. There were a lot of writers before me that did that, but now it's come to the point where my website is quite popular. When I first started it, I didn't even start deliberately. I didn't think, okay, I'm going to start this website. It really was an accident. On my own blog, I just wrote an article, one satirical article, like in the fake news style of satire article, and I wrote one article about the local city council in my small town, right? So it's not a sort of article that's going to get a wide reaction because I'm writing about just my little small town, right? And I wrote it and I put it on my blog, and usually things that I wrote, maybe 50, maybe 100 people would read them. I posted this satirical article, and all of a sudden I saw thousands of people were reading it. In a city, in a town that only has less than 20,000 people, thousands of people have read it. Like a huge percentage of the town had read this article, and I was like, wow. Satire seems to work, seems to get a reaction, seems to get people talking. And so a few weeks after that, or about a month after that, I decided, okay, well, I'll register a domain name, I'll make a logo. I wrote 5 articles to begin with because I didn't want the website to just have one article, So I wrote 5 articles to begin with. I've written one every single day since then for 4 years, sometimes more than one a day, to the point where now, after 4 years, we're getting very close to having written 2,000 articles. And the website has gone quite well. It even was mentioned in the Canadian House of Commons in the Parliament when they were debating a bill. It was mentioned as an example of humor. They knew it wasn't one of those cases where they thought it was real. They knew it was a joke, and a member of Parliament was reading my headlines in the House of Commons. I never would have thought that this website that I started and just typing in my office here at home would become this thing that was being talked about in the House of Commons. It's pretty amazing. One of the things that I think you'll notice about satire is that it's often very specialized. The humor, the jokes are very particular to a particular group of people. So, for example, even on a very big website, like, say, The Onion, which is this American satire website. But even when I read The Onion sometimes, and even though Canada is quite similar culturally to the United States, although maybe without some of the negative things that they have going on there, even though there's a similarity in the culture, oftentimes when I read The Onion, I don't get all the jokes. If it's referring to some American politician that I don't know about, I'm not going to get the jokes, right? So satire is one of these things where it does require knowledge, it requires literacy, and it's not necessarily going to be a particular article or a particular joke won't necessarily be cross-cultural. Compare that to, say, slapstick. So slapstick humor, physical humor, people getting hurt or something. That's one of those types of humor that is cross-cultural, cross-age, cross-time period even, right? If you could go back 100 years ago and people were laughing at Charlie Chaplin, right? 100 years later, people still laugh in movies when people get hurt. And it's cross-cultural, and it's cross-age. A young person can find it funny, and an old person can find it funny, and no one has to explain the joke to you. Whereas satire does require knowledge, and it does require literacy in a sense, and it does require people to be taught to read it and understand it. I think if you understand it just naturally, probably somehow you've had experiences in the past where you've become familiar with this type of humor that have led you to the point where you can understand it very easily. But for a lot of people, I think it needs to be taught. So, as I said, I have taught satire in my grade 12 English class, which is, literature class, for many years. So these are 17, 18-year-old students. But I think it's definitely something that could be taught in secondary school and also post-secondary school. If you have a creative writing course or a literature course or whatever along those lines, even in a social studies or history class or something, I think satire could be an important thing that, if it's not part of the curriculum, probably it should be. And not just the reading of satire and understanding satire, whether it's political cartoons or news satire, but also having students write satire, because if they're writing it, if they're writing it, they're going to understand it when they see it, and that's really important. I used the word fake news there earlier, and I know it's a controversial word. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the website Snopes.com, but it's a fact-checking website. So they will look at all the misinformation that's on the internet, and there's lots of it, right? And they will fact-check it and see if it's accurate or not. And recently, a while ago, they stopped using the term fake news. And the reason they stopped using the term fake news is because it doesn't have an agreed upon definition. So some people use fake news to refer to satirical news, like Punocracy or The Onion or The Daily Bonnet or things like that. I don't really think that word should be used to refer to satirical news, because satirical news is never intending to deceive people. It's never intending to trick people, to fool people. It's intending to get people thinking, get people talking, get people to make a point or to make people laugh. Nobody's supposed to read it and think it's real. Now, do people read it and think it's real? Yes, sometimes they do. In the early days of the Daily Bonnet, that happened more often than now. In the first few months, sometimes people mistook the articles for real articles. Now that it's been around for a few years, that's much rarer, just because people know what it is, right? So sometimes fake news is what they're saying by that is satirical news. Then, of course, there's the deceptive fake news, where people are writing articles, maybe just to get clicks on the internet and make some money or something. Or maybe they're doing it for political purposes, to deceive people, to sway the vote or something like that. And then I think there's a third definition of it, which is the way that Donald Trump uses it. And that is to refer to real news, like, say, the New York Times or CNN, that he thinks has a bias against him. So when he says fake news, he doesn't really mean fake news. What he means is news that I don't like. He's using it as a pejorative term. He's using it as an insult. He's calling real news fake news because he's trying to insult or make people distrust the real news if it makes him look bad. So that's kind of a third definition of fake news. And so because the word fake news has these different definitions, Snopes.com has stopped using it because it doesn't have an agreed upon definition. So maybe we should not use it. Maybe we should just call it satirical news, when referring to what we're talking about here, which is satire. So I think if we're clear in that distinction, that there's a difference between satirical news and fake news, false news, if we're clear on that distinction, then I think maybe it'll be received better by people when they know that our intention is not to deceive anyone. Now, I also think that satirical news has the potential to grow and become much bigger. At least, what I've noticed in North America, at least, and I'm not as familiar in other parts of the world, but in North America, at least, satirical news used to be just The Onion, basically, for a long time. And then in the last few years, you've seen a growth in satire. So it's not just, and sometimes it's very specialized and specific, like I was talking about before. So you have a Canadian satire website, or even more specific than that. You might have, in Canada, we have ice hockey satire websites, or there may be a music satire website or something like that. They can be very specific and appeal to a very specific niche group of people. And that's one of the power of the internet, is that you can reach that group of people. So I think, the potential for a lot of people to write a lot of satire websites and, and be creative. There's income potential there as well too. I think definitely there's a lot of potential for a lot of people to do that, and people can find the particular satire website that reaches them or speaks to them. One thing I think that you should consider when you're writing satire, and these are things that I try to keep in the back of my mind when I'm writing satire, is what's the tone that I'm using? There's two terms that are used to describe the different types of satire in terms of tone. Of course, I haven't really talked about that. Satire could be film, it could be books. It's not just websites, But the two distinctions that I'm talking about here are between Horatian satire and Juvenalian satire. And these are, I think, Greek or Roman terms. And Horatian satire is the gentle, lighthearted satire. I've had some reviews of my book, of my novel, which is also a satirical novel, where people really liked it because it was respectful satire. In other words, it poked fun at a particular group of people in a particular culture, but did so in a respectful way, where they could tell that it wasn't bitter and angry, right? So that's Horatian satire. And most of the satire on the Daily Bonnet and in my book would fall in the category of Horatian satire. But then there's also a type of satire called Juvenalian satire, which is the harsh, angry, bitter satire. A really good example of this would be Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal, which is a classic from the 18th century, and I really recommend, if you haven't read that you read that. It's a really great example of Juvenalian satire, where you can tell by the tone that he's angry at this group of people. He's attacking a group of people. The message of the lighthearted Horatian satire is, this is silly, this is funny, this is cute, whatever, something like that. So, for example, in Horatian satire, you might poke fun at your grandmother's cooking or something like that, right? Or I've made a lot of jokes because I actually live here in Manitoba. It is the coldest place, and a lot of time, I'm sure Canada gets cold in winter. It's not cold all year round, but in winter it gets very cold. And in where I live in Manitoba, it's basically the coldest part of Manitoba. There's some places way up in the north that are colder, but they're very sparsely populated. So Winnipeg, which is near where I live, is the coldest large city actually in the world. And you may find this hard to believe. There are actually times when Winnipeg in winter is actually colder than Mars. This is actually factually true. You can look it up. It gets so cold, it's colder than Mars. And thankfully it's not quite that cold yet. And so I wrote a satire article about a Winnipeg couple that decided to take a nice, warm, tropical vacation on Mars, as if somehow going to Mars would be an improvement, and they would feel like it was this nice, warm place to have a vacation and go on the beaches of Mars or something like that. That's, again, an example of Horatian satire. It's lighthearted. It's not angry. It's just poking fun at our bad weather, But then there's Juvenalian satire, which is the angry satire. And sometimes, if you're dealing with really important social issues in your society, if you're dealing with political issues or social problems, then you might need to write in that more angry tone. The thing you have to keep in mind is is that people will react in accordance to the tone that you're using. It's kind of like, when you're a kid and your mom tells you to do something, and you say something that you shouldn't say, and your mom says, "Don't speak to me with that tone." I don't know if your mom ever said anything like that, but don't speak to me with that tone of voice, right? And there's a tone that you use, and people are going to react in a certain way if you use that tone. I think one of the great things about satire is because there always is a sense of humor to it. Or at least if you can keep that sense of humor to it, you can open up discussion about topics that people might not otherwise want to discuss. What satire does is it tells stories, which is always a good thing to get people's attention, and B, it has humor. So not only are you making a point, but you're telling a story and you're adding humor to it. So the fact that you're telling a story plus you've got humor makes it much more acceptable, palatable for people to read it and think about the issues and so on. And I've seen that on the Daily Bonnet when I've done more Juvenalian style satire, when I've done more political satire. Not all of the articles are like that. Some of them are just joking about food or the accent that we speak with or something like that. But when I've written political satire on there, I've noticed that the conversation on Facebook, for example, is much more productive than it might be if I had just written here is my opinion on this topic. You get a lot more attention, and people accept it more because there's a joke to it. I don't think that you're going to change somebody's mind by writing a satire article. I think that's maybe putting too much of a burden on yourself to say, I have got to change someone's mind with satire. I think that's a gradual process, but I do think you can get people thinking and talking. The last thing I think you need to consider when you're writing satire, and what I try to keep in mind is am I punching up, down, or a third one that I added to this is punching sideways. The metaphor here, of course, is if you're punching up, this is like the speak truth to power thing, right? Someone with less power is satirizing the person with more power, celebrities or politicians or things like that. And that has always been the use of satire. And that's a good and effective and powerful thing, right? But of course, you can also use satire to punch down. And that's where the reaction of your audience might be, you shouldn't be joking about that. If you're making fun of vulnerable people in a society, that's punching down. And I always try to be careful that I'm not doing that. And then the third one that I add to it, I think there's a third option there, which is punching sideways, self-deprecating humor. Sometimes, in addition to writing about my own cultural and religious background, sometimes I'm literally writing about exactly myself. People also accept that a lot more than if they feel like you're attacking them. So if you keep those things in mind, consider the tone, and that you're always punching up or sideways, I think those are some things that will make satire more accepted. Anyways, again, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me. I really enjoyed being able to chat with you. If you have questions, you can send me an email about it, which you can find on my website. I was very happy to participate and contribute, and I really hope that you found my words helpful to you.